The protagonist is staring intently at his maid named Lilith because he finds her efficiency suspicious, so she approaches him to see how she can help. The protagonist can't help but think it's suspicious because when his parents died, he had to dismiss all the servants since they didn't leave much inheritance, and he decided to live alone and do all the household chores himself. However, this didn't go very well as he didn't know how to cook, wash, or clean. But after a disastrous day, Lilith entered through the door and asked for work in this house without any servants. The protagonist tried to refuse since he had no way to pay, but Lilith only wanted to be hired and would do it for free. So, the protagonist named Yuri ended up accepting because it seems familiar to him, as if he had seen it at some point in his life. Returning to the present, he can't believe how perfect she is, as everything she cooks is delicious, the laundry she washes smells too good, and everything she touches is clean. So, he asks her if she's some kind of witch because she can't be so perfect, and Lilith blushes and, to avoid having to respond seriously to his compliments, plays along and tells him she is, but before she can clarify that it's a joke. The protagonist gets upset because now her perfection makes sense. Because of this, Lilith blushes and leaves, using the excuse that she has things to do. The protagonist spies on her to find out her motive, and instead of assuming it, he asks her directly. She lets out a smile, so the protagonist gets angry, but Lilith explains that it's inevitable when they see her in such an adorable way. Also, he's not ready yet to know her motives, so the protagonist increases his suspicions that she's plotting something at night. Yuri has a nightmare and goes to get some water, but sees Lilith in the kitchen, so the next day, he thinks she was putting something in his food. Lilith jokingly tells him it's a love potion, so Yuri gets scared because now everything makes sense since every time he sees her, he feels something in his chest. But in reality, Lilith didn't want to admit that she was embarrassed because she was learning about cooking to please Yuri. The protagonist feels uneasy as she always changes the subject, and Lilith calls him by his name. So, the protagonist gets nervous because the only people he knew who called him by his name were his parents, who were deeply in love. Lilith blushes upon hearing this, so she runs away from embarrassment. Yuri worries because she knew his name, which means she knows a lot about him, so he doesn't know what to do with that information. He checks Lilith's room to know her information and waits for her to call him by his name to do the same and make it clear that he also knows her things. But this doesn't go as he wants because Lilith calls him master again. The protagonist wonders why she doesn't call him by his name now, and she tells him that if she did, their relationship would be closer. Then Yuri knows that wouldn't necessarily be the case since it was only the case with his parents. So, he decides to grow up quickly to learn everything about her and reveal his intentions. Before sleeping, Lilith remembers why she came to this house, and it turns out she found out about the death of the protagonist's parents and rushed to his house because she knew this family from before. Days go by, and the protagonist gets used to living with Lilith, but suddenly a lot of new clothes appear, and he gets his new console at breakfast. So, the protagonist realizes that Lilith was responsible for everything as always. Yuri finds it very suspicious and thinks she wants to control him with all these gifts, so Lilith plays along and asks him what he would do if that were the case. So, Yuri tells her that he is the master of the house, so he will dominate her. Lilith blushes a lot, so the protagonist asks her for more food, and Lilith obeys to escape. Later, the protagonist starts studying, and Lilith keeps coming into his room for anything, like giving him sweets or seeing what she can do to help him. Yuri gets angry because her coming in and out distracts him. She has to leave for a while, and this seems very suspicious to the protagonist, so he goes to spy on her and sees her doing something innocent, petting a stray cat. The protagonist is afraid of them, so he keeps his distance, but ends up saying that he can't concentrate on the beauty of the cat if she's there overshadowing it. Lilith blushes, and the protagonist decides to confront his fear of cats. Lilith wanted to help him, but he wanted to do it alone since he's the master of the house, so Lilith leaves him to handle it. He starts playing with the kitten, but Lilith has to go shopping, so she asks him to feed it. An older stray cat shows up, and the protagonist gets scared, but the kitten tries to defend him. Despite the other cat being bigger, Yuri realizes this and steps in to protect his kitten. The other cat leaves to avoid trouble, so the kitten becomes fond of the protagonist. Lilith returns and hopes everything went well, but she's surprised to see that he's no longer afraid of the kitten, though she feels a bit envious that the caresses aren't for her. Yuri notices this, so he pets Lilith's head, and she blushes at the protagonist's compliments. At lunchtime, Yuri is very surprised at how delicious Lilith's food is, so he asks her to teach him to cook as well since the last time he asked, she dodged the question. So, this time he'll be more direct and even tells her that he'll marry her, and that's why he wants to learn to cook like her. Lilith blushes and agrees to teach him, but when she sees how he handles the vegetables, she almost has a heart attack, so she teaches him step by step. After preparing everything, the protagonist feels proud of his first stew, even though it didn't taste the same, so he asks if it's the same recipe. Then Lilith forgot to mention the secret ingredient, which is that she puts a lot of love into her food. To Lilith's surprise, Yuri takes it quite seriously and sees it as the reason why he can do everything so well because of the love he feels towards him. Yuri was happy with everything he achieved during the day, but he still found it suspicious that Lilith knew him so well, and also because she fell asleep after he did. So, he kept thinking it was very suspicious. Then he decided to stay awake to find out what she was doing while he slept, but these were just words because, in the end, he did fall asleep. It turns out that Lilith only waits to sleep until he does because she visits him every night to watch him sleep. Now classes begin, and Lilith is worried that he has to go alone, but the protagonist tells her that he'll manage that way, so he asks her to take care of the house anyway. Lilith checks Yuri from head to toe to make sure he has everything he needs, and he doesn't like it because it reminds him a lot of his parents. Lilith gets nervous and sends him to school. Here, the protagonist was the topic of conversation since several people knew his parents were no longer there, so his classmate Tsukasa wanted to support him however she could since she liked him a lot when they first met. But this girl was quite shy and couldn't find the moment to talk to him. Lilith decides to pick up the protagonist anyway since it's her duty as a maid. Yuri is uncomfortable seeing her, but what surprises him the most is Tsukasa because by the way they talk and Lilith's robotic behavior, he thinks they're in a forbidden relationship. And everything gets worse when the protagonist talks about Lilith's beauty and how they spend all their time together. Tsukasa's butler looks for her since she's been delayed too much, and Lilith recognizes her because she also knows Tsukasa's family, so she asks her to continue being Yuri's friend. Because of this, Tsukasa is delighted with the woman, and her butler agrees, so Tsukasa tries to get her to wear her dress, but she refuses categorically. In the house, Lilith suggests making some delicious burgers, so after cleaning up, she goes to the market. The protagonist realizes that he has the house to himself, but decides to live a libertine life until she returns. Meanwhile, Lilith has trouble finding the fish she needs as it's scarce and highly demanded, but she refuses to give up because she wants to make the best dinner possible for Yuri. She ends up going to another town. It's almost dusk, and the protagonist starts to worry because she has never been out so late without informing him. He tries to call her, but she left her phone at the mansion, so she couldn't let him know she was delayed. Yuri becomes even more anxious, especially since the train lines are delayed, so she wouldn't have been able to return home. Tsukasa's butler found her and helped her get home. Upon entering, she sees the protagonist sad with teary eyes, so she asks if she put a curse on him since he had never felt this way due to someone's absence. He feels terrible as if he couldn't live without her. Lilith plays along, and the protagonist makes her promise never to leave like that again without informing him. Days later, Lilith wanted to dress more formally since the day before she had proposed to be a better adult influence for the protagonist. She starts observing him more closely, which angers Yuri because he thinks she's looking for his weak point, so he tries to escape. Lilith falls while trying to reach him, and the protagonist falls with her, telling her that he has to keep an eye on her because he doesn't plan to let her go ever. Yuri starts observing Lilith even more, and he blushes a bit, trying to act like an adult by letting her know that he spends a lot of time watching her. Lilith pretends everything is fine, although it isn't. She tries to make him believe that she knows how he feels, but Yuri finds her very suspicious as he doesn't understand how she realizes that he only thinks about her. He tries again to get closer to him, and Yuri is quite happy because he agreed to play any game, and he chooses chess because of the love he has for this game. When he was a child, his parents were always very busy, and when they were home, he wanted to play with them, but they were always working. So, he sneaked into his father's office, and he taught him to play chess. Since his mother was represented as the queen of the house, he had a lot of affection for this game. Lilith realizes how important it is to him, so she tells him they'll play all the games he wants the next day. The young woman sees the protagonist feeling down, so she decides to prepare pudding to cheer him up, but she is surprised that he doesn't suspect anything. Although that would be the most normal relationship between a master and his maid, she wanted him to suspect her. She observes him closely, but the protagonist ignores her, leaving Lilith even more surprised as she doesn't understand why he behaves that way. It turns out he was just gathering courage to ask Lilith to come on the school's free day when the maids of the students go. He is embarrassed to ask her this because he didn't want anyone else but him to see her. Going back to the previous point, Lilith dresses formally to adhere to the school's guidelines since, according to the protagonist, her clothes were not quite normal by standards. So finally the day arrives, and Yuri was worried because he didn't know if Lilith had the right clothes to wear. Besides, he had bad memories of that day since his parents were always busy, so he felt it would just be another year of being alone. But this time is different because Lilith shows up very elegantly dressed in the butler uniform of her house. Upon returning, the protagonist thanks Lilith for coming, as it made him very happy, and she feels the same having received his invitation. The next day, the protagonist was running around, and Lilith wonders what's going on. It turns out the protagonist had a sports festival and was training. So Lilith encourages him, but Yuri doesn't move, as he can't take his eyes off her. The next day, Yuri tells Lilith that he couldn't concentrate because his mind was elsewhere. Lilith blushes, and Tsukasa was spying on them because she likes how they get along. Also, Lilith is quite pretty, and Tsukasa would like her butler to be more like her, so she asks if being herself is not enough. This direct attitude makes Tsukasa change her mind since it's what she likes most about her in the mansion. Lilith starts researching training, so she makes a routine for him to shine in the festival. But the first day doesn't go well at all because the cat interrupts him, or he loses control on his own, or he flies off like when he practiced strength. Lilith tells him not to get discouraged since he's training to improve. So the protagonist gets excited again, but now he's sore all over from spending time training. Lilith gives him some massages as she can't let him wake up tired. Days go by training, and little by little, the protagonist improves until he starts breaking his own records. On the other hand, Tsukasa goes with her butler to tell him her problems since she told her parents about the festival, but they can't go because they're busy working. So she had to put up with it and smile, but she starts crying in front of her butler. So he offers to accompany her, and Tsukasa smiles as it was her plan from the beginning, and she pretended to be hurt with fake tears. The next day, the sports festival begins, and some boys try to bother the protagonist for being poor, but he challenges them directly, so Tsukasa gets excited seeing so much tension in the atmosphere. Although she ends up even more moved as she sees the protagonist inspired by seeing Lilith since she encourages him with a reward if he wins. And Tsukasa thought it would be some kind of forbidden thing. So she tells him she'll support him in whatever way she can, and together they manage to win their first trial. Tsukasa eagerly awaits to see the rewards Lilith will give, but the protagonist did it just to see her smile, so Tsukasa can't even stand when she sees how cute they are. Then there's a small break, and Yuri wonders if doing so many things bothers Lilith, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So he asks her to run in the parents' or guardians' obstacle race, so Lilith gets nervous since she's his maid and fears something might go wrong. However, she'll do it anyway because she doesn't want to disappoint him and wants to do everything possible to make him happy. The protagonist cheers her on from the stands, so Lilith manages to win first place, and the protagonist's classmates complain because she's a maid. So the protagonist jumps to defend her since she's more than a maid because he considers her family. They leave him alone, and the protagonist tells her she has to be that because every time he sees her, his heart beats. So he begins to doubt if these feelings were the result of Lilith's manipulation. So he continues to find her suspicious. Days later, Lilith goes shopping, and it starts raining, so she arrives all soaked. The next day, the protagonist realizes that Lilith started making mistakes, which had never happened before. So he starts observing her and realizes she has a fever. He takes her to bed and tries to take care of her. Lilith gets angry because she shouldn't be in a lady's room, so she gets up to continue working because she wants to always be by the protagonist's side. She thinks that if she doesn't do her job, she'll have to leave him. Yuri tells her that's not true because she's his precious family, and now they need to rest. The next day, Lilith was much better, but the protagonist had doubts, so he keeps watching her so she won't overexert herself. He also helps her with her tasks, saying he wants to spend as much time as possible with her, making her blush. The protagonist spends the day cleaning the house with Lilith but starts feeling quite cold. So she wraps him in a blanket, but Yuri worries about her as her clothes show a lot, which he doesn't like, and seeing she's cold too, he shares the blanket with her so she won't get sick. Lilith is glad she got sick, but runs away so the protagonist won't hear what she said. Days go by, and Tsukasa invites the protagonist to her Halloween party. So he checks the costumes he can use, and Lilith offers to make him one. The protagonist is surprised at how perfect she is and thinks she must have been equally efficient in her previous house. Lilith avoids this conversation and asks him what color he wants the gem of his staff. The protagonist leaves it up to her choice as he wants it to be the color she likes. On the day of the party, Lilith also dresses up, so Tsukasa gets excited to see such a cute dragon, and as they chat, the protagonist has a lot of fun, so he thanks Tsukasa for inviting him. She's also happy he came since she has many fun costumes, but she feels something is missing, so she looks at her butler and forces her to dress up. She blushes with embarrassment as they dressed her up as a princess, but thanks to this, Tsukasa has a great time. The butler feels she just did her job fulfilling her little master's wish, although she's already planning next year's costume. The protagonist finds it very suspicious, and at dinner, he realizes the food isn't as good, making it even more suspicious. Then Lilith tells him that when she came the first day, everything that gave her strength to go on was seeing the protagonist's happy face, but this will be the last time he sees her. Yuri is surprised to hear this, and it turns out Lilith's former masters found her and ordered her to return to her old mansion, but the protagonist refuses to let her go because, due to the spell, he won't be able to live without her. And now she's his master. On her side, Lilith tears up the letter and decides to stay after hearing the protagonist's words, so he feels relieved and hugs her tightly. The next day, Yuri conducts a test to see what he does in his daily life, and he only does one thing, which is always thinking about his maid. Tsukasa gets very emotional hearing this. The protagonist continues talking about how he feels when he watches Lilith, but also mentions that he finds her suspicious because his heart beats fast when she's near. Then Tsukasa thinks it might be love. Yuri doesn't understand what she's saying and keeps talking. So after exceeding Tsukasa's expectations regarding their relationship, he realizes the protagonist doesn't know how he feels, and that's why he thinks he's sick or something. Then he reveals that he's most likely in love with her. Yuri is surprised but doesn't know what that means, so he remains pensive when he gets home, completely ignoring Lilith's provocations, so she gets scared and tries to ask, but the protagonist is about to tell her but decides to keep it to himself for now. The next day, he confesses to Tsukasa that he doesn't know what love is, so she invites him to her house to teach him what it is. Yuri is surprised because the atmosphere at her house is very similar to what he had, so he doesn't like it much. Tsukasa asks about Lilith since it's rare to see them apart, but the protagonist tells her that she returned halfway because he thought that seeing Tsukasa's environment might make her want to stay and work there, where there's more work. Then Tsukasa scolds him because what Lilith likes most is being with the protagonist, so if there's work, she wouldn't leave him. The protagonist is comforted to hear this. Then Tsukasa wants to start with love lessons using her romantic novels, but her butler takes them away because she can't take them without permission. So the protagonist leaves without learning anything about love, although when he gets home, he confirms that Lilith looks happy with him. The next day, they're assigned the task of drawing something of their choice, but it has to be something they can look at steadily to capture the nature of what they draw. So the protagonist decides to draw Lilith to uncover her deepest secrets. She is surprised they ask her this and gets a little nervous as the protagonist stares at her steadily. Then he asks her what pose she wants, but Yuri wants her just the way she is. The girl thinks about being seen naked, but he just wants a neutral position since that's how he always sees her, and that's when he sees her greatest beauty. After a while, Lilith is surprised at how good an artist the protagonist is, but for him, it's not enough since she's much more beautiful in person, so he decides to keep going until he's satisfied. Because of this, he ends up very tired and can't sleep because he's thinking too much about Lilith. So he tries to help him with relaxing scents, music, and more, but nothing works, so Lilith jokes that maybe if she sleeps with him, he can sleep, and he takes it seriously, so they both get into bed. The protagonist, half asleep, asks her what she's doing in this mansion as he wants to know everything about her, but she doesn't respond and instead sings him a lullaby that his mother used to sing, and another person he doesn't remember who. So he falls asleep, and the next day he wakes up full of energy. The protagonist asks her about the lullaby from the previous night, but Lilith acts clueless, and the protagonist decides they'll sleep together while he finishes his drawing because he wants to find out what he felt that night, but thanks to his great inspiration, he wins the drawing contest. Days later, it's Lilith's day off, but she still wakes up the protagonist and prepares breakfast for him. So Yuri forces her to take her day off because, as a good master, that's what he has to do, and the girl has no choice but to go out, although since she dresses so elegantly, she catches the protagonist's attention as he doesn't know who she's going to meet. It turns out Lilith meets Tsukasa's butler as she wanted to ask her for advice, but she's surprised at how trustworthy she has become. At school, it was a concern whether she could do her job well, but now she knows why she changed since those days. Lilith asks her how she got to the point where Tsukasa opened her heart completely since after all this time, she feels she's still not there. But the butler tells her that maybe she has to open hers first to see if the protagonist can do it because she supposes he hasn't told her his whole story yet, which was true. The butler tells her she should be able to tell him now, but the protagonist was listening as curiosity got the better of him. So he asks what she's talking about, and he hears the lullaby, which brings back some childhood memories. When Lilith arrives home, the protagonist waits for her at the door to ask her about the conversation she had. Then he tells her he followed her because he couldn't stand the fact that she dressed up for someone else other than him. Yuri gets straight to the point and asks if what she has to tell him is that they knew each other since he was a child, so Lilith is surprised that he knows this is true. Keep it to himself for now. Then the protagonist explains that he remembered some things from his childhood when he met her, although now she is too different from how she was back then, but anyway, he doesn't understand why she didn't say anything. The girl explains that she feared he would hate her if she told him everything, so the protagonist gets a little angry because he would never do that, so he decides to remember everything about her. Then the next day, he gets up early and recreates some memories they have to try to remember, but this doesn't work, so he goes to school before it gets late and leaves this for when he returns. Meanwhile, when the protagonist arrives at school, Lilith finds many hidden letters in the protagonist's room, and on the other hand, Tsukasa asks him how far he has progressed with Lilith. He doesn't know what to say, so she is more direct and asks him about his love for Lilith. Yuri didn't remember this topic as it completely slipped his mind with everything that had happened, so he tells her they slept together. Tsukasa thinks of obscene things, so she wants more details like when he confessed and other things, but Yuri seems oblivious. So she is surprised and tells him he has to declare his love first since he's clearly in love, and that's why he can't stop thinking about Lilith. The protagonist is surprised because it would make a lot of sense for that to be the reason he spends his time observing her, so he runs to his mansion to declare his love directly, and the maid blushes. But another servant named Natsum interrupts them because she wants to take Lilith with her. It turns out she was a former classmate who can't accept that Lilith is working in that house where there are no other servants and for free. Therefore, she insists that she returns for her own good to the other place where she pays her, and here she could get recognition. Furthermore, her master cannot be a little boy, so she wants him to prove that he is really a master worthy of Lilith, so she asks the protagonist several questions, but in reality, she wasn't good at anything she demands. So she can't blame him in the end since even the protagonist as a child had better prospects for being a good master. Natsum gets angry and accidentally breaks a lamp, but the protagonist is more concerned about her than the lamp, so Natsum is surprised and thinks it's a strategy to win her over. But Lilith clearly tells her that she wants to stay with the protagonist and that despite being classmates since academy and having helped each other for a long time, it's her decision and she wants her to respect it. The protagonist wonders why she's so insistent and concludes that she also likes Lilith just like him, and that's why she wants to take her away. Natsum gets nervous because she doesn't know how she can say those things with such a serious face, but Yuri is not surprised because it's the only way Lilith could find out about his feelings. Due to this, Natsum ends up admitting that she likes her and that she can't stop thinking about her, and that's why she wanted to know if she was okay, but Lilith doesn't change her mind. Natsum stays because she wants to see how hard it is to work as the only servant in an entire mansion, but she can't help being a guest, so she just observes and wonders how she can bear all that work day after day. So Lilith replies that it's all for her master. When he arrives, he was all sweaty because he had run to see Lilith as soon as possible because he can't stop thinking about her, so Natsum is surprised because she doesn't believe anyone can respond to those words coming from a child. As flirtations are things for adults, but somehow Lilith was blushing, so it surprises her. Then Yuri asks her if she's really a servant because she wasn't doing anything, so Natsum gets upset and tries to demonstrate her servant skills, but everything goes wrong. She even ends up soaking Lilith, so she apologizes. Although Lilith laughs as it reminds her of their days in her old mansion, where she always ended up helping her, and that way she improved her domestic skills. Yuri tells them to bathe quickly so they don't get sick, and they end up bathing together. Then the maid tells her that she appreciates her being there, as since that moment, the protagonist began to express his feelings, and she doesn't know how to respond exactly to what she feels. Although in Natsum's eyes it's totally different since her face says it all. Lilith is embarrassed to hear this as the protagonist may have noticed, so they come out burned from the bathroom and the protagonist wonders what they've been doing for so long. The next day, Lilith realizes that Natsum had gone out the other way. On the other hand, the protagonist was talking to Tsukasa as she wanted to know the progress he had with Lilith, so he tells her that his family has grown. So Tsukasa imagines that they even got married and had a child, so the protagonist clarifies things, but it's still less interesting, as a love triangle in his house. But before she can know more, her butler takes her away. The protagonist realizes that Natsum had gone to pick him up as he wanted to observe him closely, but when they return, he realizes that the protagonist bumps into a high school boy who almost hits him, so she expels them so they leave him alone. Yuri was grateful, so he agrees to do her any favor, so Natsum asks him a couple of things. When they get home, she locks herself in. So Lilith is surprised at how much their relationship has improved. Then she goes in to gossip and sees that they were discussing about what costume Lilith should wear for Christmas, so when Lilith leaves the house, Tsukasa arrives. Who couldn't be happier to be part of a surprise party? They start helping, and her butler distributes the roles, but she gets the most boring part, which is decoration. So while the protagonist prepares the birthday cake, he realizes that the butler of his house really gets along with her, so the latter wanted to help with the cake because they all do it together. On the other hand, Natsum doesn't know what to talk about with Lilith, so she looks on the internet and sees that she can invite her something to eat, but since she was very upset, she stumbles. Lilith helps her and thanks her for spending time with her since she thinks she's interested in someone. else for the Christmas gift magazine she was looking at. Although Lilith doesn't know it was for her, after this, they manage to go to various places and Natsum is encouraged to give her a Christmas present before returning to her mansion, which was a pen so they can keep in touch. Lilith feels very grateful for the gesture. Then they return to the house, and they realize that everything is dark, but when Natsum lets her guard down for a second, Lilith had disappeared, so she enters the house and is surprised since the party was actually for her. It turns out that on the night of the day they planned everything. The protagonist told Lilith about it, and they changed the plans, so she started enjoying the party, eating cake, playing board games, and talking. Finally, the party ends and Tsukasa leaves with her butler. Then the protagonist and Lilith start talking about how well this party turned out, but Lilith reminds him that her gift is still missing since she had worked hard to learn how to knit to be able to make a pair of gloves, which she leaves with a Christmas card beside where she fell asleep. Days later, Lilith sends the protagonist and Natsum for groceries. But in that moment when she's alone, an unexpected visitor arrives. Her former master came to see her because he wants to know her state and wonders if her decision has anything to do with her past. It turns out that when Lilith was a child, her parents died, and she lived from family to family, whether direct relatives or friends of her parents. But one day she arrived at the protagonist's place, and his parents agreed to keep her for as long as necessary. Additionally, she had a prejudice about her purple eyes, thinking they were scary, but the protagonist complimented her for having such beautiful eyes, so she grew fond of this family. She decided to study to repay them for everything they did for her, but upon learning they were no longer there, she couldn't help but feel that the protagonist would experience the same fate as her. So she ran to his house, feeling it was now her turn to protect him. Back to the present, the protagonist arrives and is surprised by the visitors, but upon learning it's Lilith's former master, he jumps to protect her because he thinks he's there to take her away, although he clarifies things as it's not his intention. He just came to pick up Natsum and leaves, wishing to visit them again so that Natsum doesn't miss Lilith too much. Later, after everyone left, dinner time was much quieter, but Lilith gets nervous as she doesn't know how to have a private conversation with Yuri since she declared her feelings to him. So she decides to go out alone with him the next day, despite being nervous about Yuri seeing it as a date. The next day, the protagonist compliments her on how good she looks, making Lilith blush, but Tsukasa sees them from her car, although she can't do much as her butler doesn't let her skip classes to satisfy her romance quota. After a while, they go for a coffee to warm up, and the protagonist asks her to accompany him to a place he wanted to go for a long time. They visit Yuri's parents' grave because he didn't dare to go alone, but with Lilith's company, he could gather the strength to visit them. So she tells him he doesn't have to feel sad because they are taking care of him from heaven, and Lilith also says goodbye to them, telling them that she will take care of their son now. In the evening, the protagonist stares at Lilith as she blends in very well with all the city lights, and he can't stop thinking that they haven't been alone for a long time because with Natsum in the house, she barely had time for him. So from now on, he wants to make the most of the time they have alone because he loves her very much. Lilith wonders what kind of love she feels, but the protagonist still doesn't know, so Lilith confesses that she is with him because he is him, not because he is her master. So regardless of his decision, she will always be there for him because he hasn't changed with her since they met, so for now, being by Yuri's side is more than enough for her. And that's how the anime ends. And that's the end of the summary of this wonderful anime. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, as it helps and motivates me to keep creating more content for you. See you soon.